Welcome to the Vine Resources Podcast Show with your host, David Lawrence.
Welcome to another edition of the Vine Resources Podcast Show. Well, today I've got a really interesting guest. He's on the line from Boston, hopefully, from his home. Got an amazing business. Recently had a new Series B investment round, over $30 million. His name's David Friend, and he is the president and CEO of Wasabi Technology. David, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, pleasure. Nice to be here.
David, we just before we started, we talked about your business, hot cloud storage. It is hot. It's a hot area. Tell us about your company. Tell us a little bit more about Wasabi Technology, please.
Sure. So this is my sixth company, if you can believe it. The last one was a company called Carbonite that was a very successful backup company, was sold last year for $1.5 billion. So we're cloud storage experts, and we decided to start Wasabi because we knew that we could do a better job at cloud storage than Amazon, Microsoft, and Google were doing. And we came out with our product, which is nearly identical to Amazon S3 cloud storage. The only difference is that we're 1/5 the price and faster. And we launched that product in May of 2017. We've grown very rapidly. We've raised over 100 million in equity today. We have about 3,500 MSPs and VARs as resellers. We're primarily a channel-oriented company, and we have over 18,000 customers, including some very big names. And we're growing probably 40 to 50% quarter over quarter. So we're on a real rocket ship right now.
Wow, what a story as well, and not small change to be selling your previous company for. Tell us though. You've obviously been in the game for a long time, David. You know the ups and downs, the good and the bad. What was it like back in 2015 when you said, or whoever said, right, we're going to start this new company? Tell us what the first 3, 6, 12 months was like. Tell us about that.
Well, people take data storage pretty seriously, and at the very beginning there was like, well, who the heck is Wasabi, and why should we trust you with our data? And I fully expected that, because when we started Carbonite, 10 years prior to that, we heard the same thing. We were backing up people's computers, but they would say, who the heck is Carbonite, and why should I trust you with all my data? And it takes several years to get past that. People start to see that you're there for good, and you've got lots of other customers that are using you, and eventually people start to accept you as part of the fabric of the SaaS world. So that's kind of where we are today, and we're on this very fast exponential growth curve, and companies that probably wouldn't have looked at us a couple of years ago or even 1 year ago are now coming back saying, gee, I can take that $100,000 a month storage bill from Amazon and cut it by 3/4. And so, the companies that came to us first are the ones for whom storage costs were, painful. So this would include, TV and movie studios, surveillance, medical records, where there's a lot of X-rays and medical imaging and things like that. So those people would look at us and they'd say, wow, for the difference in price, let's give these guys a try. And I think, the first few years, a lot of what we got were second copies of data. Somebody already had their data on in-house on-prem storage or in somebody else's cloud, Microsoft or whatever. And they said, if we're going to make a second copy of this data for backup and security reasons, why not put that data in another vendor so we don't have all our eggs in one basket? But now, increasingly, we get the primary data. And because we're hot storage, we're not archival storage. We're fast and inexpensive, and we've got very fast pipes going into our data centers. Increasingly, we're getting what I'd call primary data now.
That's really interesting. So, was that early first couple of months? Were you sitting around the coffee table or the office talking about your strategy for taking on the world? How did that go?
Well, it took us 5 months to sell our first petabyte of storage.
Interesting.
Today we sell a petabyte of storage almost every day. So, it's a big difference. And yeah, I mean, selling that first one, I still have the little $1 bill that one of our customers sent us payment for his first couple of gigabytes of storage.
That's fantastic. I love that.
But the first you get one, and then you get another, and the early customers were tended to be very small,
Yeah.
and now we get customers who are sending us petabytes, many petabytes of data. So it's we're kind of in a different place right now.
I think you made a really good point about that's interesting, that and that secondary data. So it's really, getting that opportunity where that trust isn't built yet. How have you built that trust? Because this is obviously a big challenge for organizations, and security and risk for data being hacked into. How do you build that trust, particularly in organizations that are probably very corporate, complex organizations? What's that like nowadays? What do you see as the challenges?
Well, I think the biggest concern people have with young companies like Wasabi is, are we going to go out of business and take their data with them? And that's a bigger concern than just plain security hacking and so forth, because we do this pretty much the same things that Amazon and Microsoft do in terms of security. I mean, all of that stuff is pretty well known in the industry, how to protect the data. So, the issue really is, if you were looking at Wasabi saying, why should I trust Wasabi? You might want to look at the fact that we've raised a lot of money, that we have a management team in place that's been through, 5 previous successful companies, that we have 18,000 customers, and I mean, at some point, people look at the totality of your business and they just say, you know what, these guys are clearly going to be around a while. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And of course, we get lots of great endorsements from our customers, which we put into our marketing materials, people telling us how great our customer support is and how solid the product is and all this sort of stuff. And so, we market hard and we spend a lot of money on our brand. And, we want to make sure that, when somebody thinks about, gee, I want to move my data to the cloud, that Wasabi is the first thing that pops into their head. And, so that's marketing. And we've spent quite a bit. I believe in spending money on your brand, because that tells the world who we are and what we stand for.
Where did the name come from? How did that develop?
Well, Wasabi is hot, and
Of
we're hot
course.
storage. We looked at, choosing a company name is very important, and Carbonite was a great company name that worked out really well for us. We probably looked at over 200 different possible names, and when we saw Wasabi, one of these domain sellers, in fact, in the UK, owned it and was selling it, we said we have to have that name. And it was very expensive. It was very expensive, but we took a deep breath and bought it anyway, because it's one of the most important decisions you can make. I like names that when you hear it, you can spell it. There's a lot of company names out there that have no idea how the heck to spell it if you hear it. And I want a name that kind of sticks in your head and has some association with the product. Since you're in the UK, you probably know that there's a chain of sort of down market sushi restaurants called Wasabi.
I know it.
Not a week goes by that we don't get an email from somebody complaining about the tuna wasn't fresh or something like that. I think they have wasabi.co.uk. But
they do.
But somebody's mad because they didn't like the waiter or they didn't like the sushi. They just send the email to complaints@wasabi.com.
Well, they missed the chance to buy the .com, obviously, and that's another. I'm sure you could tell me some stories about domains buying over the years. Yeah. David, tell me this. Just bring us up to date. obviously it's been a challenging period. We're not going to we're obviously doing a podcast here, but you've given me the delights of your beautiful view out of your house in Massachusetts. Tell me what it's been like during this COVID period, the change in working environment, how it's impacted your business, your team, and how you've adapted to that environment for the business.
Well, I think, Wasabi, like most of the cloud vendors, has benefited from from the work at home change, because people who were storing their data on-prem in EMC and NetApp and HP servers and things like that found that it was pretty hard to take that infrastructure and make it into a work-at-home infrastructure. They didn't have enough bandwidth. They didn't have enough VPN licenses. It was complicated, and so I think it accelerated the migration of data to the cloud, which has benefited us. And we've had record week after record week after record week since May, or since March, when the whole thing started. Now, as far as the company goes, we used to be all together in a nice office building downtown Boston. And, one day we just closed the place down and everybody went home. And that's caused some challenges. It's hard to develop that esprit de corps when people are working at home. And in the last 6 months, we've probably added 30 new people to the company who I've never met. I've seen most of them on a Zoom call, but I've never met them. And to me, as the CEO, I mean, I like to have a very collegial company culture where, people can joke and talk to each other in the cafeteria, and, everybody gets together and rings the bell when we have a big sale or something like that.
I like that.
But it almost feels today like we've got 100 consultants instead of 100 employees. I think I think this is going to be true of everybody. I think to some extent we're burning through our social capital. People are working hard and they're putting in the hours, and progress is getting made on all fronts and so forth. But there's just something missing about, I call it the Wasabi team. And it's hard to have that same team spirit when you don't get to see people face to face. You don't get to go out to lunch. You don't get to have a beer after work, and all these sort of things that make the workplace an important part of your life. I mean, you go home and you've got your home life, but your colleagues are, very close and very influential in your day-to-day life. And, you don't really get to see them. So after a while, I think people will eventually start to feel kind of burned out on the isolation. So I'm certainly starting to feel that personally.
How do you see that? I mean, that's some great insights there, David. I mean, I've talked to a lot of other business owners about these challenges, and how do you see it playing out over the next 12 months, 12 to 18 months? How do you see it changing, particularly if you're hiring, junior people who need to be around other people, and you also need that creativity spark, as you quite rightly said, those sideline conversations outside of the work environment. But how do you see this progressing if we're kind of stuck in this loop for the next, hopefully not 12 months, but could be?
Yeah, well, I don't want to force anybody to come back to work until they're comfortable. But you mentioned the younger employees, and the people who are complaining the most are the young salespeople, who a lot of whom are sharing an apartment with somebody else, and it's hard to concentrate when your roommate is in the living room playing video games or listening to music or something like that. And I think that's a little stressful. So they're very anxious to get back to work. And I think as the office reopens, it'll open slowly, and the people who live nearby, who really want to be in the office, who just want to get out of their apartments and be able to concentrate, I think will be the first to come back. And luckily, we don't have one of these open office environments. We've got, the space that we're in was vacated by a law firm, and so there are lots of small private offices. And so I think this will make it very easy for us to allow, some percentage of the workforce to come back in. to the extent that they want to. Now, having said that, we've always had most of the employees working from home at least part of the time, and particularly the engineers. Some of them live an hour from Boston. I'd rather have them, and they're all mature, I'd rather have them sitting at home working rather than spending 2 hours a day, sitting in traffic. And so typically in the past, everybody's come in at least one day a week, just so that people have a chance to interact personally. But I've never been really big on having everybody come into the office every single day. If you've got people who live an hour or more away, it's sort of a waste of time when you think about it. So I think what'll happen is, some of the young salespeople will start to come into the office on a regular basis, and then we'll start to have, small groups, work groups, like salespeople and marketing teams and things like that. Will alternate, different days of the week start coming in, so that all the salespeople are in one day, all the marketing folks are in another day, all the DevOps people are in another day, and that sort of thing.
David, you've obviously, been hugely successful in your career. You could easily, I'm sure, retire on the golf course now and probably lead a nice life. I'm curious, what's driving you? What keeps you motivated to get out of bed every day and run a massively growing company? What's the bits that keep you going every day and get you out of bed?
Well, I really enjoy the process. In college, I studied music composition, and I quickly realized I was never going to be able to survive doing that. But I like the process of starting with a blank sheet of paper, and then you start to fill in the notes, so to speak. And when you're done, you have a composition. And starting a company from scratch is a lot the same. When we started Wasabi, it was just me and Jeff Flowers, my longtime co-founder, sitting around his kitchen table, shooting the shit, and trying to figure out what it was, how we wanted to bring this to market. And I would do market research while he was writing code and that sort of thing. And now you see, Wasabi all over the place. It gets written up all the time. It's acknowledged as being one of the hot companies in Boston. And, everybody wants to be part of it now. So it's, we started with nothing, and now 3 years or 4 years later, we've got something which is making an impact on the world. And I like these, this sort of disruptive pricing kinds of businesses, because some of my previous companies, you build a product and then you find out nobody really cares. Well, everybody needs storage. And if you can do storage for a fraction of the price of what's out there in the market today, it's like somebody who discovers how to make sheet steel for 20% less. Storage is storage, and why would you pay more, when the stuff you can get for less is just as good or better? And so I like this. A lot of people think storage is a boring business, but it underlies almost everything that we do. There isn't a company on the face of the earth that doesn't store some data. And so everybody is a prospect for this. And over the next decade, most of the world's data is going to migrate to the cloud. It's just starting really now, even though there's a lot already in Amazon and Google and so forth. But when the dust settles, I'd like as much of the world's data to be stored in Wasabi as possible. So that's a really great challenge. And, when I am finished with Wasabi, either because it goes public and somebody else becomes the CEO, or somebody comes along, Oracle or Microsoft or somebody, and buys it for a lot of money, we'll have something to look back on and say, gee, we really changed the industry. We changed the way people thought about storing data. We changed people's view from being, wow, storing data is expensive and we have to be careful, to storing data is like the least of our problems. It's so cheap. Let's keep everything forever. So if we can achieve that, it'll be really fun to look back at it and see what we did.
With the experience of COVID and the challenges that we've been through the last 6 months odd, What's the reflection points that you've taken away from it that you come out as the positives? How have you thought about your life and your business and your team? And what's the real things that have added value that you think that you're not going to change or you're going to keep now?
Well, people always ask me, how can you possibly compete with Amazon, Microsoft, and Google? And, some of the investors that I talked to early on, when I told them what we were doing, they looked at me like I had two heads. But truth of the matter is, no matter how big you are, you can't be best at everything. And we decided to take the resources that we have and just be best at storage and stick to our knitting. So the key here really is to stay very focused and just do that one job really, really well. Luckily, that storage is such a big market that we can be a giant company and still only have a very small percentage of the stored data in the world. I was just reading an IDC report that said the amount of cloud storage from Microsoft, Google, and Amazon went up 75 exabytes just in the last quarter. So we don't even make a rounding error at this point, in the total amount of storage. So
it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Well, tell me this: if you were giving one person a piece of advice about managing tremendous change in their business, what would you say to them?
Well, in terms of doing my job, the CEO's job, I have this view of how management ought to work, which is a little different, I think, from the sort of classical view. Most people think of an organization as a pyramid with the CEO at the top. And I've always worked on the principle of having that pyramid be upside down with me at the bottom, because the real work gets done on that big flat side of the pyramid, where the engineers, the salespeople, the marketing people, and all that sort of thing. And my job is really just to create an environment in which all those people can really flourish. So that means, we need to have funding so that people can get paid. They need a nice office to come to. They need a work environment that isn't hostile and has, people in it that makes you not want to come into the office and that sort of thing. So that's the way I tend to manage. And, I like to see that the real work gets done, by the individual contributors. And the higher up you go in the hierarchy of the organization, the less I think you're contributing on a day-to-day basis, but the more you're creating an environment in which the people under you or over you, in my view of things, can flourish and get their work done and be creative.
In terms of where the future's going and the direction, what's exciting you in the industry, and where do you see the next few years going within the cloud storage market?
So, the amount of data being stored in the world is growing so fast. Genomic data, for example, is doubling every 7 months.
Wow.
Surveillance data is growing by, probably somewhere between 30 and 50% year over year. Every time you turn around, cameras are higher resolution. There are more of them. There's 350 million surveillance cameras in operation in public spaces around the world today. Everything is producing more data. Just the camera in your phone has gone from 2 megapixels to 8 megapixels to 12 megapixels. And now 5G is coming along, and that's going to give probably 1,000 times the amount of bandwidth that people have had. And, you don't create bandwidth without somebody coming along and figuring out a way to use it. So that bandwidth is going to start, talking to your thermostat, to your Tesla, to, everything. And there's going to be, that's just going to unleash an additional flood of data. And all of this needs to be stored somewhere. And all the great advances that are going on in AI and machine learning and so forth, all depend on having large data sets to work with. Yesterday I was talking to a doctor at Mass General who's involved in using AI to detect breast cancer, and they now have AIs that are better than human radiologists in detecting breast cancer. But the way they did that was by training the AIs on a huge volume of X-rays going back 20 years. And if you didn't have that data, you couldn't make that advance. So people are now taking a new look at data, and they're saying, wow, instead of throwing that data away because it's costing me X dollars a month to store it, I better keep it, because next year somebody's going to have an algorithm that is going to produce enormous value if I keep this data. If I don't have the data, I may not be able to use it. So I think we're unleashing, by changing the mindset of storing data from being one of, wow, it's expensive and we better limit how much we store, to an abundance mindset where we say, wow, data is so cheap, who cares how much we store? Let's keep everything, because tomorrow we discover a really important use for it. That's what we're participating in by having this really disruptive price. It's not like we're 10% cheaper than Amazon. We're 1/5 the price of Amazon. So it's almost an order of magnitude, in terms of the reduction in cost.
If I was David, if I was selling to sorry, I'll put that another way probably. If I what's it like to be selling to, let's say, an AT&T? What's the difference between selling to an AT&T or going and talking to the state of New York, the city of New York City, who want to surveil the whole city and put that in the storage? What are the differences between selling to a public and private company, and what's important to them in their cloud storage solutions?
Well, we don't have AT&T, but we do have NTT, which is the biggest carrier in Japan, as a partner. And they run data centers for a pretty high percentage of the largest companies in Japan. And every time one of their customers packs up and moves to Amazon, they've lost that customer forever. And so, a few years back, they decided to fight back, and they have now got the NTT cloud, which is directly competitive with Amazon. And instead of developing all of the components, they went out and partnered with what they thought were the best of breed partners in every area. So, compute, storage, AI, facial recognition, voice recognition, so forth and so on. And they picked us as the storage partner. So we are the storage part of the NTT cloud. It's a long sales process. I can't tell you how many meetings we had. I lost track. But it took, they looked at every vendor in the world, I imagine. And, teams of engineers coming over to Boston, many, many conference calls. So that's a big process. But, in the end, if you get a customer like that, it's a big deal, right? It'll produce millions and millions of dollars worth of business over time. On the other hand, of the 18,000 customers we have, there's probably 100 that are kind of like that, that are really big deals. And then there are lots that come to our website, put their credit card in, and buy, a few terabytes of storage. And, at our prices, a terabyte of storage is $6 a month. We can't even afford to talk to them. If they call up and have one question to customer support, we've probably lost money on that customer for the next 5 years. So, so it covers the whole gamut. And it's a bit of a challenge running a business or structuring a business where the largest customer to the smallest customer might have a ratio of 4 or 5 orders of magnitude.
Very interesting. Can you imagine doing that NTT deal during COVID, all over Zoom or Skype?
Well, it would have been harder. I probably would have been better because there were a lot of trips to Japan, and there were a lot of trips from Japan over here, and I'm sure those guys would much rather have stayed home rather than having 14-hour flights, back. But
It,
yeah, I mean, I think it could have been done. It's surprising when you can't go in person. It's surprising how much you can really get done with conference calls. It's just we're in this mindset of the face-to-face meeting is sort of obligatory part of doing business, and it's almost like you must suffer if you want my business.
but on the upside, a bit like that creativity side, I'm sure there was new alliances and friendships made in person that you just can't do over Zoom or Teams or whatever. That's always the challenge. David, tell me this from your childhood. What was have you got a story from your early childhood that really set your work ethic up for your life? Is there anything you could share with us?
I don't know about work ethic, but I was always in trouble as a kid because I was always blowing something up or setting something on fire, and but not in a malicious way, but just because I was always trying to do things that were way beyond my capabilities, and so my poor parents, had to deal with this. Always one thing or another. I had a basement laboratory, and was doing things that were dangerous all the time, and they had no idea what I was doing down there. But every now and then there would be an emergency, and somebody would race down with a fire extinguisher. But I never really had a desire to work for anybody else. I always, when I was in grad school, I had a part-time job working for RCA, which was a big company, and they were actually paying to put me through grad school. But when I thought about it, I shared a lab with some guys who'd been there 20 years, and the idea of sort of knowing where I was going to be in 20 years just didn't sit right with me. And so, when I had the opportunity to sort of go off and start my first business, I did it immediately. So,
Fantastic.
Some people are just wired that way, and there are other people it just turns them into a nervous wreck. But I
Luckily
sort of,
for you.
yeah, I like the sort of the chaos and unpredictability of kind of life that I've led. You never know what the heck's going to happen.
I think I was attracted to fire as a kid. I think my parents were worried I was going to be an arsonist or something, but I just like lighting fires at the back of the house. David,
understandable.
David, if you just as a final question, and thanks so much for your time today. If you were giving your 20-year-old self one piece of advice now, looking back, is there anything that you'd tell your 20-year-old self?
Yeah, learn how to sell. Carry a bag, because even as a CEO, you spend your whole day selling. You have to sell investors on putting their money into a company. You have to sell prospective employees on the idea that they should quit their really posh jobs and come to work for a startup that can't pay them as much. I mean, all day long, you're selling. And I wish I had had the experience as a kid of even just having a newspaper route, or a lemonade stand, or, something like that. I think that it took me a while to figure out that, somebody's got to sell this stuff. That's when the salesman meets the customer. That's when the rubber meets the road. Everything else doesn't count, and one of my colleagues once said, the only thing software is good for is to sell. And it's a little offensive to a lot of people, but I get it. I mean, if you build it and it doesn't sell, who cares?
Yeah, great points. David, thank you so much for sharing your stories. I probably could ask you loads more questions for another hour and a half and get some really good life hacks out of it, but well, that's for another day. David, if people want to find out, connect with you, if they want to find out about Wasabi Technologies, what's the best way they can do that?
Just go to wasabi.com and, on the management profiles page, there's a thing about me, and I think there's a link there that will let you contact us.
Fantastic. And obviously, wasabi.com.
Yeah, and you can send an email to ceo@wasabi.com. That also reaches me.
Fantastic. David, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the business. Good luck with winter coming up as well. It's going to get a bit colder for us all. More so in Boston. I know how cold it is up there. And we'll speak soon.
Okay, thank you.
We really hope you enjoyed the podcast today. If you want to listen to more exclusive tips and life lessons from our guest, go to the resources page at vineresources.com.